Heavenly Stories.
In a sprawling valley, where golden fields stretched beneath a sky as wide as hope itself, there lived a man of considerable wealth named Amos. His estate was a patchwork of olive groves, vineyards, and grazing lands, tended by loyal workers who respected his steady hand. Amos had 2 sons, each as different as dawn and dusk. The elder, Jacob, was a man of duty, his hands calloused from years of labor alongside his father's workers. The younger, Levi, was a dreamer, his eyes always fixed on the horizon, where distant cities whispered promises of adventure and freedom. Levi, barely past 20, felt the weight of the estate like a chain. The rhythm of planting and harvesting, the endless cycle of chores, suffocated his restless spirit. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of amber, Levi approached his father. The old man was sitting on the porch, his weathered face softened by the twilight. "Father," Levi said, his voice trembling with resolve, "I want what's mine. Give me my share of the inheritance now. I need to find my own way." Amos's heart sank, but his face betrayed no anger. He knew Levi's fire, knew the boy would not be swayed. In the customs of their land, such a request was unheard of. A son demanding his inheritance while his father still lived was a wound, a declaration of independence that cut deep. Yet Amos loved his son too much to bind him. He called for his steward, and over the next few days, they divided the estate. A third of the wealth, gold, livestock, and goods, was converted to coin, a fortune that could sustain a man for years. Jacob watched in silence, his jaw tight, as the workers loaded bags of silver into Levi's cart. The morning Levi left, the air was crisp, and the valley seemed to hold its breath. Amos stood at the gate, his eyes tracing the figure of his youngest son, who didn't look back. Levi's cart rattled down the dusty road, the clink of coins echoing like a heartbeat. He was bound for a city far beyond the hills, a place of markets and music, where life pulsed with possibility. The boy's heart raced with anticipation, imagining feasts, friendships, and nights under starlit rooftops. He felt free, unshackled from the expectations of his father's world. As Levi disappeared over the horizon, Amos turned back to the house, his steps heavy. Jacob, already in the fields, drove his hoe into the earth with a force that spoke of resentment. The estate felt quieter, emptier, as if Levi had taken a piece of its soul. Amos prayed silently, asking for his son's safety, though he knew the dangers of the world Levi sought. The city was a labyrinth of temptation, and Levi, with his eager heart and heavy purse, was unprepared for its snares. Levi arrived in the city after days of travel, his eyes wide at the sight of towering buildings and bustling streets. The air was thick with the scent of spices, roasted meat, and perfume. Merchants called out, their stalls overflowing with silks and jewels. Levi, flush with wealth, found himself welcomed by strangers who became fast friends. They led him to grand houses where wine flowed like rivers and laughter filled the air. He bought fine clothes, dined on delicacies, and joined in dances that lasted until dawn. The city embraced him, and Levi, intoxicated by its allure, believed he had found his place. Weeks turned to months, and Levi's generosity knew no bounds. He paid for feasts, gifted gold to his companions, and lived as if his wealth were endless. The city's pleasures were a whirlwind, and Levi spun within it, blind to the dwindling weight of his purse. His new friends, ever present when the wine was poured, began to thin as his coins did. The laughter grew hollow, the nights colder. Levi barely noticed, caught in the spell of his own freedom, until one morning, he reached into his bag and found it nearly empty. The city, once a glittering dream, began to show its sharper edges. Levi's purse, now light as a feather, could no longer buy the smiles of his so-called friends. The grand houses where he'd feasted closed their doors, and the market stalls, once eager for his coin, turned cold. A famine swept through the land, as if the earth itself conspired against him. Bread became scarce, prices soared, and the streets, once alive with music, now echoed with the groans of the hungry. Levi, who had never known want, felt the gnawing ache of hunger for the first time. Desperate, he wandered the city, seeking work. His fine clothes, now tattered, marked him as an outsider, a fool who'd squandered his wealth. No merchant would hire him, no innkeeper would spare him a crust. At last, he found a man, a gruff farmer on the city's outskirts, who offered him a job tending pigs. It was degrading work for a man of Levi's upbringing. Pigs were unclean, their stench a daily assault. Yet Levi had no choice. He took the job, sleeping in a crude shelter near the pens, his hands blistered from shoveling feed. The pigs ate better than he did. As he tossed husks into their troughs, his stomach growled, and he eyed the scraps with longing. Once, he sank so low as to snatch a pod from the ground, but even that was bitter and unfit for a man. He sat in the mud, surrounded by the snorting beasts, and felt the weight of his choices. The city's lights, so bright from a distance, now seemed a cruel illusion. His freedom had become a prison, his dreams a mockery. He thought of his father's estate, where even the hired hands ate hearty meals, and tears stung his eyes. Night after night, Levi lay awake, the stars above mocking his fall. He remembered his father's gentle voice, Jacob's steady presence, the warmth of the table where they'd shared meals. Shame burned in his chest, shame for his greed, his recklessness, his betrayal. He had demanded his inheritance, as if his father were already dead, and now he was the one dying, piece by piece, in a foreign land. The thought of returning home crept into his mind, but it was a fragile hope, crushed by fear. Would his father even recognize him? Would Jacob, ever dutiful, scorn him? Yet the hunger, the loneliness, pressed harder than pride. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Levi made a decision. He would return. Not as the proud son who'd left, but as a beggar, willing to work as a servant if it meant a place at his father's gate. He rehearsed his words, his voice breaking as he whispered them to the empty air, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son, make me one of your hired servants." The words were a lifeline, a fragile thread to pull him back from despair. Levi rose, his body weak but his resolve firm. He had no coin, no cart, only the rags on his back and the memory of home. The journey would be long, the road unforgiving, but he clung to the image of his father's house, its stone walls glowing in the morning light. He left the pig pens behind, the city's clamor fading as he walked. Each step was a confession, each mile a prayer. The famine had taken his wealth, but it had given him clarity. He was not the man who'd left, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could be something new. As Levi trudged onward, the land grew familiar, the hills softer, the air sweeter. His heart beat with a mix of dread and hope. What awaited him? Forgiveness? Rejection? He couldn't know. But the thought of his father's face, even if it turned away, was enough to keep him moving. The valley was still far, but it called to him, a beacon in the wilderness of his soul. He walked, one foot in front of the other, toward a home he'd forsaken, praying it would not forsake him. Back in the valley, time had carved its mark on Amos's estate. The fields still yielded their bounty, the workers still toiled, but a quiet sorrow hung over the house. Amos, now grayer, moved slower, his eyes often drifting to the road that had swallowed his youngest son. Each morning, he walked to the gate, his steps a ritual of hope, scanning the horizon for a figure that never appeared. The workers noticed, whispering among themselves, but none dared speak of Levi. Jacob, ever the dutiful son, buried his pain in work, his silence louder than words. Amos carried Levi's absence like a stone in his chest. He remembered the boy's laughter, his wild spirit, the way his eyes lit up at stories of far-off places. He blamed himself, wondering if he'd been too soft, too indulgent. Yet love, not anger, defined his days. He prayed for Levi's safety, for his return, though the years stretched on without a sign. The estate prospered, but it was hollow without the son who'd brought it life. Jacob, sensing his father's grief, worked harder, as if his labor could fill the void. One evening, as the sun painted the valley gold, Amos stood at the gate, his eyes tracing the familiar curve of the road. A figure appeared, small and distant, moving slowly. Amos's heart quickened, though he'd been fooled before by travelers and shadows. He squinted, his breath catching as the figure grew closer. The gait, the slope of the shoulders, it was Levi. Thin, ragged, a ghost of the boy who'd left, but unmistakably his son. Amos's knees trembled, and he gripped the gate to steady himself. Without a word, Amos ran. His old legs, unsteady from years of toil, carried him with a strength he didn't know he had. The workers in the fields paused, their tools frozen, watching their master race down the road. Dust rose around him, his robe flapping, but Amos saw only his son. Levi, seeing the figure approaching, froze. Shame flooded him, he was filthy, unworthy, a failure. He opened his mouth to speak the words he'd rehearsed, but before he could, Amos reached him. Amos threw his arms around Levi, pulling him close. The boy's frame was frail, his clothes reeking of sweat and earth, but Amos held him as if he were a treasure. Tears streamed down the old man's face, wetting Levi's hair. "My son," he whispered, his voice breaking. "My son, you're alive." Levi, overwhelmed, tried to speak. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you," he began, his voice hoarse. "I'm not worthy," but Amos hushed him, his embrace tightening. The words didn't matter, his son was home. Amos called to a worker nearby, his voice ringing with joy. "Bring the best robe, the one from my own chamber. Fetch a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet. And prepare a feast, slaughter the fattened calf. My son was dead, and now he's alive, he was lost, and now he's found." The worker, stunned, ran to obey, spreading the news through the estate. The house buzzed with activity, servants rushing to prepare a celebration unlike any the valley had seen. Levi, still dazed, felt the weight of his father's love. The robe, soft and heavy, was draped over his shoulders, the ring, a symbol of family, slid onto his finger. Sandals covered his blistered feet, and he stood, not as a servant, but as a son restored. The shame that had haunted him began to lift, replaced by a warmth he hadn't felt since childhood. The valley, once a prison, now felt like a sanctuary. The feast was being prepared, music already rising, but Levi's heart was full simply standing beside his father. As the estate came alive with preparations, Jacob was in the fields, his hands gripping a rake, his brow furrowed with the day's labor. The sun was low, casting long shadows, when a worker approached, breathless. "Your brother's back," the man said, his eyes wide. "Your father's called for a feast, the fattened calf, music, the works." Jacob's grip tightened, his knuckles whitening. Levi, the reckless one, the one who'd spat on their father's love, was home. And they were celebrating. Jacob didn't move. He stayed in the field, driving the rake into the earth, each thrust a release of the anger that had simmered for years. He'd stayed, worked, honored his father while Levi squandered his share. He'd watched Amos's heart break, seen the old man's eyes search the road, and now Levi, the prodigal, was welcomed like a hero. The injustice burned. The music from the house reached his ears, a joyful melody that felt like a mockery. As night fell, the feast began. The courtyard glowed with torches, tables laden with roasted meat, fresh bread, and wine. Guests, neighbors, workers, friends, laughed and danced, their voices mingling with the strum of lyres. Levi sat near his father, still adjusting to the weight of the robe, the ring, the love. Amos's face shone, his laughter louder than it had been in years. But Jacob's absence was a shadow, unnoticed by most but heavy on Amos's heart. Amos stepped outside, his eyes searching the dark fields. He found Jacob near the barn, alone, his face set like stone. "My son," Amos called softly, approaching. Jacob didn't look up. "Father," he said, his voice tight, "all these years I've slaved for you. I never disobeyed, never asked for a dime. Yet you never gave me so much as a goat to celebrate with my friends. But this son of yours, who threw away your wealth on harlots, comes crawling back, and you kill the fattened calf for him?" Amos's heart ached at the pain in Jacob's voice. He stepped closer, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. "Jacob, my son," he said, his tone gentle but firm, "everything I have is yours. You've always been with me, and all that's mine is yours to share. But your brother was dead and is alive again, he was lost and is found. How could I not rejoice?" Jacob's eyes glistened, but his jaw remained set, his heart wrestling with his father's words. The music continued, a distant echo of joy, but Jacob stayed outside, his thoughts a tangle of duty and resentment. He'd been the faithful one, the one who stayed, yet the celebration was for the one who'd left. Amos stood with him, silent, his presence a quiet plea for understanding. The night stretched on, the feast a world apart from the field where father and son stood, bound by love but divided by pain. The feast carried on, the valley alive with light and laughter, but the true work of healing was just beginning. Levi, seated among the guests, felt the weight of his return. The robe, the ring, the feast, they were gifts he didn't deserve, yet his father's love had given them freely. He caught glimpses of the workers' curious stares, heard whispers of his past, but Amos's hand on his shoulder steadied him. Still, Levi's thoughts turned to Jacob. He hadn't seen his brother, and the absence gnawed at him. Amos, torn between his sons, returned to the feast but kept an eye on the door, hoping Jacob would join them. He knew his elder son's heart, knew the years of loyalty that had gone unspoken. Jacob's anger was justified, yet Amos longed for him to see the bigger truth: love didn't diminish when shared, it grew. Levi, too, felt the need to bridge the gap. After the meal, as guests danced and the music softened, he slipped outside, his heart pounding. He found Jacob by the barn, the same place Amos had left him. The elder brother stood in the moonlight, his arms crossed, his face a mask of hurt. Levi approached, his steps hesitant. "Jacob," he said, his voice low, "I know I don't deserve to be here. I messed up, bad. I hurt you, hurt father. I'm not asking you to forget, but I'm asking for a chance to make it right." Jacob's eyes met his, cold at first, then softening as Levi's sincerity sank in. Jacob didn't speak, but he didn't turn away. Levi continued, his words spilling out. "I was a fool, thinking the world out there was better than this. I lost everything, but I found something too: how much this place, this family, means. I'll work, Jacob. I'll earn my place, not as a son, but as a servant if that's what it takes." The humility in Levi's voice, so unlike the brash boy who'd left, stirred something in Jacob. The brothers stood in silence, the night air cool between them. Finally, Jacob spoke, his voice gruff but softer. "You broke his heart, Levi. And mine. But he never stopped loving you. That's what kills me, how he could love you after all that." Levi nodded, tears in his eyes. "I know. I don't understand it either, but I'm grateful. And I'm sorry, Jacob. For everything." Amos, watching from a distance, saw his sons talking, their silhouettes framed by the moonlight. He didn't approach, giving them space to mend what time and choices had torn. The feast continued, but the true celebration was here, in the quiet steps toward reconciliation. Jacob didn't join the dancing that night, but he walked back to the house with Levi, their steps slow, their words few but heavy with meaning. The parable of the prodigal son didn't end with the feast, but with the promise of a family made whole. Levi learned the cost of his freedom and the depth of his father's love. Jacob wrestled with his resentment, finding in his brother's return a chance to redefine his own loyalty. And Amos, the father, stood as a testament to grace, his love a bridge over the chasms of sin and pride. The valley, once divided, began to heal, its fields ready for new seasons, its hearth warmed by forgiveness.